What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over something that is going to be useful for a lot of episodes down the line. And essentially what that thing is being able to differentiate between pressing, holding, and releasing inputs. So you won't really be able to tell based off of any differences that we see here in our actual game. Everything that we see here is stuff that we've already been able to do and have done for quite some time. So I won't stretch this on for too long, so we'll just go ahead and get started so that you can see the benefits of this firsthand. So if we go into our code, our fighter template character.h, and I should say now that we are pretty far along in the series. I believe we're episode 86 at this point, and we have much longer to go. So if you'd like to catch up and join us on our journey, then feel free to click this icon in the top right corner right here. Check out the fighting game playlist. I will also link the first episode of the input buffer right here if you'd like to catch up on our input system. All right, so with fighting games, you have all sorts of different attacks that you can do. You know, you can do your standard attacks by pressing a button. You can do directional attacks by moving in a direction and then pressing a button. You can do your special attacks by performing a sequence of buttons, and we can do all that stuff currently. Something we cannot do yet are charge attacks and multi-button inputs. So charge attacks are basically when you hold a direction for a certain number of frames and then perform an input, and that action actually gets processed into a move. So for example, you might have to hold back for about 30 frames and then press, your light attack. And you'll actually do a different attack than you would just by pressing back and then pressing light attack. So to do that, we need to kind of know if a button is being held or if the move is being charged in some way like that. We also need to be able to know if multiple buttons are being pressed on the same frame or within a leniency period, basically a period of frames in which we are counting two buttons, two inputs, as being pressed at the same time or around the same time. And so a good way to do that is to just make sure that we know which buttons are being held or have been pressed and not released. So to get started today, we're going to be basically adding these things to our system. It won't make a huge difference with anything we have currently because we don't have any of these other actions in. Like, even when we tell that an attack is being held or released, we still need to do all the logic for a charge attack and for a multi-button attack. So we will see those in their own episodes, but this is going to set up the system to allow us to do that. Now, in our fighter template character, we have a lot of enums already. We have our character state, our combo state now, our input type. We have structures for commands and inputs. So today we're going to go through and we're going to clean up the few comments that we had left in our system, because at this point, all the videos are archived that we're using it, so you guys can check them out. And if you don't want to use the new system, of course, I already showed you the old system. For me to clean it up and so that I don't have to keep explaining why these things are commented out, when we come across comments that I'm not going to re-enable throughout the series, then I'm going to take them out. So first things first, in our F input info, just to kind of refamiliarize everyone, this is a structure that basically stores everything we need to know about our actual input that we press. It's an individual input, so it could be, analog stick value, it could be a button, it could be anything. It's basically just knowing what type of input it was, light attack, medium attack, the jump button, any of that, and the frame it was pressed on now. This old stuff that I had commented out, and the reason I brought that stuff up, was related to seconds. And we don't need the seconds, we don't need the name of it anymore. We have a much more dynamic system now. So, my F input info now looks like this. And I've also added this new thing called input status. So that's what we'll cover next. Okay, so in fighter template character, I've added a new enum and I've called it E input status. And input status is essentially just whether we're pressing, releasing, or holding. I do have a default value in there that's none. It probably won't be used. It can be used for things like determining if we have errors in the logic, and also if we don't want to specify. For example, we want to allow a press a release, or a hold and still perform the action, then you can just leave it as none and allow the logic to happen regardless. So we have plenty of options with this. We could technically add a few others as well, but I don't believe they'll be necessary. For more advanced things like quarter circle inputs and other options like that, I have more ideas that would not use this input status, but specifically for charge attacks and for attacks where we want to be pressing or holding two buttons at the same time. Because, again, we don't want to necessarily have to press both inputs on the same frame to perform a multi-button attack. A good example of what I'm thinking of is a lot of time in fighting games, you have a throw move where you have to press two punches or two kicks, whatever it is, and you will perform that action, in this case, the throw. So for that, if you press them on the same frame, that's easy. We can definitely make that perform the action. However, a lot of times you'll want to give leniency to the player. That way they can press them maybe 1, 2, 10 frames apart. It doesn't really matter. And that way the action can still be performed because it was humanly close enough to being pressed at the same time. So we want to know these different states and what is currently happening with the input to perform that. Now, this enum alone is perfectly fine. We don't need to do anything more with this. We just need to make a variable where we need it, which is in our input and in the command. Okay, so F command is basically, it's what it sounds like. It's basically our commands that our characters have access to. For example, Fireball, Hadouken, or Rising Uppercut, or something like this. Essentially what it means is it's an action that it has a name, it has the amount of inputs that we need and the correct inputs that we have to perform. I actually put the maximum amount of frames to require this move, to perform this move. So for example, how many frames I have between the first and the last input before I failed on performing the move. And has use command, which is used to transfer between animation blueprint states and go to that command's animation and do that logic. So this is our command. In the past, I had T-array of E input types, and basically just held these input types, and that's good enough for the simple system of the input buffering. Basically, we want to just know what types we have to press, and as long as we press them within the right amount of frames, we are good. However, if we do want to allow for charge attacks, and again, a little bit of leniency with multi-button attacks, then we're going to want to know another thing about this input, and it's whether it was pressed, released, or held. An additional note is that if we want to do something like negative edge, then we have to know if the button has been released, pressed or released. So this is actually important. We need to make sure we have these differences ready. All right. So I've added a new structure. It's honestly not necessary, but for me, I thought it was a little bit neater because it just solidifies this pairing. So instead of having the T-array of E input type, I've changed the T-array to be something called F command input. And that's this new structure that I made right here. So F command input is essentially your pairing between your input type and your input status. These two enums right next to each other. So that one input has both the type and the status tied to it. Nothing too complex there. We're pressing E forward and it's a press. Or we are on E crouch but it's a release. E throw but it's a hold. Something like that. And so you can see how I've linked that up and I've just changed the T-array. Now, there's technically one more thing here. In our F input info, I told you that I updated the input status variable here. Now, the input status variable that we just added is that enum, what I was talking about, where it has pressed, held, released. You could also use your new structure here, your F command info, for the purposes of the series, because I did not want to confuse anyone. Understand that I use input when I'm talking about something the player does. Input info, input status, input type. Okay? When I use command, I'm referring to something that's set up in the game that we are trying to match, like Fireball or, up, down, left, right, whatever. It's basically a string of inputs that we have to enter. So I called it command input. So I did not want to put a command input in the f input info. However, you could take out these two variables and use that structure if you wanted, just like we did in this array. Either way, it doesn't really make a difference. We don't need to keep an array of our inputs. Every time we add a new input, it gets added to the array, into the circular buffer. So in this specific case, it's fine if we want to have these separate anyway. But I wanted to point that out, that I'm aware that you could combine them, and no, there's not any issues if you're curious if you do combine them into an f command input, in which case you'd only have 3 variables in your f input info structure. All right, and now with that, we've added everything we need to the header file. So let's go to the fighter template character.cpp. Now, with these changes that we have, you're going to have a few errors. Not many at all, but just a few based on the input system, because we've now changed it so that it's not strictly the type. All right, so if we scroll down to our input buffer logic, the first function that we have in the code is to add input to input buffer. And what that does is it receives the value of the input that a player has put in, and it basically determines if we need to flip it, and then adds it to the circular input buffer. Now, remember, we're using our circular input buffer now as opposed to our regular input buffer where it was not adding and clearing out. So we can get rid of all of our old comments regarding the input buffer. I'm going to leave this one in, which is the log. But this is what this function looks like now. It actually has not changed at all. So we can go on to the next function. But just know, remember I left this comment when we went over the input window. Multiple inputs were performed on the same frame. That is where we can do our multi-button presses, as I covered. So we need to do more for the leniency regarding the input status stuff that I mentioned earlier. But you can see how it's starting to come together. Now, check input buffer for commands using type. Here we go. So this function is very, very similar. We're actually only changing one thing today. However, again, since we're going to clean this up so that we can more easily add to this system, all these commented blocks that I have, you can get rid of them. You do not need them. So now check input buffer for command using type is much cleaner. And it looks like this. So the only thing I've changed in this episode is I've added this right here. So e input status equals circular input buffer frame to check input status. Now, we do basically the exact same thing right up above with the input type here. Here's the difference. So we had before, this type was grabbing the circular input buffer at the specific frame that we are checking. And that was good to go because that value in the past, right here, our input types, that value in the past just was an E input type array. But now it is this F command input array, which has an input type variable. So we need to make sure that we're setting the type equal to the circular input buffer frame to check dot input type, and then the status equal to the circular input buffer frame to check input status. Also important to note in this check right here, where we check if the type is equal to the input type. So basically, if the button that the player has pressed is equal to the button that is expected by the command, such as, again, left, right, circle, whatever it may be, then we know that this is a match. But remember, we changed this type, so make sure you grab the specific input type off of here, as opposed to just this line like it was before. The status will come in the other 2 episodes. We're going to use it for both. But I went ahead and set it up now. All right. And at this point, we have determine command to use and tick. Start command and tick. But I haven't changed anything with any of those functions. The only thing we can change with tick is get rid of some of the logic we don't need. So you can leave the logs. They can be helpful to re-enable later. We no longer need the was used at all. You saw that it was coming out above. This block right here is our logic for if any of the If there's no input captured that frame, we basically set a default input and store it in the circular buffer. That's how we know how many frames apart some things are. Well, we no longer need the was used, and we don't need the regular input buffer anymore. So you can get rid of both of those and make it cleaner yet again. And then 2 final adjustments we can make that now that we've fixed up all the issues in the code, in the CPP, I mean, is we can get rid of the was used in the F input info structure because we no longer need it. Okay. And now if we build with all those changes, you'll see that it will succeed. If you have any issues, just look at it, try and figure out what we changed. We only really changed that one value from the E input type to be the F command structure, F command input structure to be exact. And now we can launch Unreal again with our changes. Now what we're going to have to do in Unreal is we have to assign the values for each attack and each command to our character to have pressed, released, and held. So in my base character BP, we have a few adjustments we have to make. I'm going to adjust the input buffer logic and yet again make it simpler. And we're also going to make sure we set our proper values in the mutant BP logic. So in the mutant BP, we have these character commands. We had this character commands array in the class defaults details panel for each character. And that's how we set up our commands. Whatever commands we want to have, we put them here for each specific character. In this case, I had all my commands ready, and they look just like this. I open it up, and it's like, oh, light attack. Let me close some of these so it's not so confusing. Okay, should be good enough. So specifically, we're looking at index 0 here. So we have the light attack. We have one input type, and then we have the basic other values for the variable. Now, if I open up input types now, before this was just light attack, but now we have our type and our status, remember that. So I can change our input status between any of the available options. For now, and for today's episode, I'm going to leave everything at press because that's how we had it prior to this point in the series, and I don't want to adjust anything on the spot. I'm just setting up the system today to support pressed, held, and released, and we will go back in their respective episodes and add times where we want to factor in press and release. Held and released. So make sure you go through and set your input type if it gets reset. Sometimes when you change a value, a variable's type, it will reset the values in Unreal, unfortunately, so you may have to reset these values. Like back to light attack, it might have gone to the default. Doesn't always. I got lucky. It did not for me. And for the input status, it'll be none by default. Again, you can leave that if you want. I went through to be super thorough because I knew I wanted all of these attacks currently to be on press, and I changed them to press. Okay? And then you just go through all your moves. I won't go through all of them just because it's not important. These moves are just mutants moves for me. You can put whatever you want, but a fireball is a good example. So we have press backward, press forward, and then press light attack. If I wanted to do like a hold or a charge, then I could do backward hold, and then we will fill out the logic for that. So that's kind of the thought process behind this. So do that for all your attacks. You can see I've got quite a bit of them going on. And then once you're done with that, you're good to go with the mutant BP. You don't really need it open anymore. One thing we do need to do is clean up our add to input buffer function, and also I'm setting up a way to add this logic to the circular array, the circular buffer, on a release as well. So it's a little tricky because we don't want to add it in there and then factor it in. If we have a press and a release, you're not going to be holding the button forever. So once you press it, you are going to eventually release it. So it depends, we're going to do specific logic to determine if this is a release attack and things like that. So don't worry too much about this for now, but I want to set this up so that you can kind of see the route we're going because I think it'll make a lot more sense. For me, it's always better to write things down and kind of prototype it up, and then it makes more sense. So in the past, you should have this. Don't worry. This is something we already had, so it shouldn't be confusing at all. I just put it into a function because it's a lot easier for us to then change minor values about it, and we don't have to copy large blocks of the blueprint. Okay, so go ahead and make a new function, plus function, and I called it determine input data for buffer. And now on add to input buffer P1 and P2, instead of having those large blocks, I just call the corresponding function. I did this because I have a status on this function. So we're going to have a press and release, and I didn't want to have 4 blocks of this in the event graph. It's honestly pretty messy. I tried to keep it as clean as I could, but there's just a lot of things we need here. And so I thought it was easier to put it into a function. For the record, while we're talking about cleaning things up, you don't need these print strings at all. They are for debugging, so if you are done with them, you can remove them. I will leave them in because I am still using them as we test different things. But they're by no means necessary. So once you've made this new function, it'll open automatically. Go to your add to input buffer P1 and P2, and you can copy the logic entirely. Like everything that'll be in here, and just paste it in here. You can see I've removed a few extra reroute nodes that I had and things like that. If you're being very, if you're really comparing exactly to what we had, but nothing has changed with the actual inputs other than the inputs that we were grabbing from this function that are now going into here. So if you compare the add input to input buffer, remember what this function is. Don't be confused. So our character, I have a character reference here, so I'm just going to drag this off so I can show you. The add input to input buffer basically just takes in an input info. It's actually our code function that we went over earlier. And we have add input to input buffer. And it takes in f input info. However, I've broken this up so that we can set everything we need to. Since we added the status to the f input info structure in the .h file right here, it now has a new variable here. So I didn't necessarily change anything about it. I changed the code and it changed as a result. But that's why you can see the nodes here are a little bit different. So let's go over this really quickly. We'll go over it one time, and then I'll show you what I have set for all 4 cases out here in the event graph. So if you click on the function itself anywhere, you can click on it in the table, you can click on it in the node in the graph. I've added 3 input parameters. So if you click new parameter and then look at your type. For the first one, we need a key. Doesn't really matter what it is. The event will pass it along. So we just need this key structure right here. Then go ahead and take the key that's from add to input buffer P1 and add to input buffer P2 and pass it into the key slots. Okay. Now, we also need, we need for keyboard mode, remember we had it set up to where player 2 reference would use their input to input type map and call their version of add input to input buffer. Just in case we want to support keyboard mode, which I'm supporting through the entire series, we do need to do this. So I've added a character reference variable that I can pass along the correct variable. For controllers, you'll only ever need this first one, so you don't even need this at all because I'm just passing self in. But it's up to you. For me, I do want to support keyboard mode, basically having multiple players on one device using different keys and splitting the input. But you can see out here, for add to input buffer P1, I'm using self for the character reference. And add to input buffer P2, I'm using player 2 reference, which is something that we've had in our character for a long time. And we use all the time throughout the series. All right. And that is just a fighter template character object reference. So your base character object reference. Okay. Lastly, I have this status now. So status is what it sounds like. I have e input status. It's the enum that we made in the code right up here. E input status. It's blueprint type, so we're able to access it in the blueprint. So you click on your type, you look for your new enum. Whoops, I don't know what happened there. E input status, and click that. I called it status. And this I'm kind of hard coding just because I know what the values are going to be. So I haven't hooked it up. Notice I have not hooked this up yet. Released is not hooked up for player 1 or player 2. And that's because if you do that, technically, I mean, it will run and it will add these to your circular buffer, which could be good, but we don't have the logic to actually parse it correctly so that it will still perform the right actions with those inputs in there. So I've intentionally left it out for now, and we'll go over that in the next episode. But I figured while we're changing the function anyway, I would just put it in place here. So all we have to do is connect the white line next time. But you can see how this works. On pressed, the status I'm passing is press. Next time when we connect release, the status I'm passing is release. And same for player 2. And now if we take a quick look at this function, just so you know everything that's going on, if you copy the logic like I had said, then you can take the key parameter that we have here and pass that into getKeyDisplayName, because that does need that parameter passed in so that it knows what key or what input can be used in the input to input type map, so that we know what input the player has pressed when they're playing their game, regardless of the controller or device they are playing on. The character reference does what it has always done. So character reference goes to input type map. If you're player 1, it'll be self. If you're player 2, it'll be the player 2 reference. And then it also goes to add input to input buffer target. Lastly, our status value, I bring it down underneath everything and send it into input info status. I left the debugging stuff alone, so again, do with it as you'd like. If it's less confusing, you can get rid of this and have your function look like that. That's the entire function. I'm putting it back just so you guys are aware, because again, I use it for the testing. But if you don't want to use it, I understand. I know it is a little messy, so there you go. All right, a few more quick notes. So one, in our tick function, you can see that where we were checking to see if we've captured input this frame or not, we were setting input type to be none. If not, same thing here. For the status, you should probably set it to enone as a default. If you are using the code classes still, it's perfectly fine if you are. If you didn't want to go the blueprint route and you're still going for the code classes, I've commented them out because I didn't feel the need to go through them all, but it's very simple. These the commands that we set up in the code will no longer work with that minor change. All you need to do to fix this up is to, where we're adding just the input type, you need to make an f command info variable. Fill out the logic to be, backward and press. And then add that variable as opposed to just e input type, e backward. You can technically do it in the same line and everything if you wanted to. But don't worry, it is still fully supported. I just want to let you know. And lastly, we have to fix one final issue in the command list itself. Because of the way we were grabbing the commands, when we changed that variable, it has had a minor impact, and you will have an error. So we'll go fix that up. Okay, so if you go to your command list widget, looks like this. This is where we show all the commands that the character has. It might be a little bit ugly now because some things changed and it's trying to resize itself. But basically, everything here is already good, already things that we've covered. But we changed the this for loop now. Instead of using input type, it's just the e input type. Remember, it is the structure now of the f command info. It's very simple what we have to do here. Let me resize this properly. There you go. So this for loop that was here in the past, you'll have to get rid of it entirely. And I'll just do it here for you for demo. You can do a for each loop. We don't need the break in this case, but you can add it if you like. reconnect the for each loop. The loop body goes to the input stack icon widget creation. And this was also going down to this node over here. Well, we still like the logic that we have, but we can't do a direct connection anymore. It won't work. So what we have to do now is drag off the array element and break it. And that way we can grab our input type directly from this break and pass it along. And it's as good as new. Lastly, for the completed, we can grab the, we can drag it into the set command name logic. Once you're done with all of that, you should be able to compile. If you had any other issues, it's probably related to that sort of thing. And then we can just go and play our game like usual. And now the next time that we go to perform attacks, we'll be able to perform held attacks, so charge attacks, and multi-button attacks. So anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed and this helped you learn a little bit about fighting game input systems, or if you just had fun, please subscribe. It does more for the community and myself than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters who have continued to support me throughout all this time. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. Be happy to help you out with any of the problems you had and talk about our plans for the future. Otherwise, guys, that's all I got for you. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.